When someone as intelligent, educated, and motivated as Dr. William Lane Craig makes really bad arguments in support of Christianity, you know it ain't 'cause he's just ignorant or lazy. Problem has to lie in the source material itself. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. We're working our way through Dr. Craig's presentation of the moral argument for God, and so far his approach seems to be firstly reducing morality to a false dichotomy, and then pleading ignorance. The false dichotomy comes when he tries to argue that either morality is some kind of universal, absolute, objective standard, or else it's just a subjective, individual, personal opinion, or in other words, an illusion that ain't got any real weight. And the ignorance comes when he says, well, where else could moral values and duties come from, if not from God? And needless to say, when it comes to looking for secular sources for moral standards, he don't look too hard. And in fact, he spends most of his time looking for stuff that he can claim ain't the source of morality so that he can claim it must be God by default. And that makes his argument pretty easy to refute on account of all we gotta do is look at the sources that moral standards do come from. Because there's a third option that Dr. Craig left out of his false dichotomy. I like to say that morality ain't objective nor subjective, it's collective. Moral standards come from social interactions and the objective consequences that they produce. But all that is just by way of review. Today we're going to make the jump into the big leagues as Dr. Craig takes on no less than Plato himself. He's going to try and solve the problem of the Euthyphro Dilemma once and for all, and his strategy is going to be to claim that Euthyphro is also a false dichotomy. And not to spoil the surprise, but Dr. Craig's attempt is going to be a fail of epic proportions. But first, let's let him explain the basics of Euthyphro. Quote, it basically goes like this. Is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? If you say that something is good because God wills it, then what is good becomes arbitrary. But if you say that God wills something because it is good, then what is good or bad is independent of God, which contradicts premise 1. End quote. And that's a pretty good summary, and I especially like that extra little footnote at the end pointing out how Euthyphro contradicts Dr. Craig's premise that God is required in order to have objective moral standards. I mean, Euthyphro does leave open the possibility that God's standards of morality might be arbitrary, but obviously Dr. Craig don't want that because that just makes God out to be a tyrant and makes right and wrong essentially meaningless. Because if we say that morality is arbitrary, we're basically saying that might makes right, and there really ain't no such thing as actual objective moral values or duties. So, either moral standards is independent of God, or there really ain't no such thing as objective moral standards. And that means Dr. Craig's first premise is in trouble. But he's going to try and save it by claiming that Euthyphro's dilemma is a false dichotomy. Quote, there's a third alternative, namely, God wills something because he is good. God's own nature is the standard of goodness, and his commandments to us are expressions of his nature. End quote. Boy, howdy, ain't that clever? Morality ain't arbitrary because it's determined objectively by God's fixed and unchanging nature, but it also ain't independent of God because it is his fixed and unchanging nature. Pretty clever. Except that, no, actually it ain't as clever as it might seem at first glance, and in fact it's a Costco-sized can of worms. So let's open it up and have a look at all the wigglies, shall we? First of all, he ain't actually solved Euthyphro's dilemma, he's just moved the goalposts. Instead of asking whether something's good because God wills it or whether God wills it because it is good, now we got to ask if something is good because it's God's nature or if it's God's nature because it is good. Remember, our sole source of information about God is the stories folks tells about him. Theology ain't like meteorology or geology or biology where you can go out and make objective measurements and observations. When theologians study God, what they do is look at the narrative they've got so far and then sit and think and imagine plausible scenarios that the fan base might go for. And if the fan base likes it, it becomes part of the unofficial canon. And if that doesn't, then it gets forgotten. And if some fans likes it and others hates it, then you end up with schisms like what you got all throughout church history. So how does theologians determine what God's nature is? They got to come up with something that sounds plausible, but if God's nature is the standard of what goodness is, there's no way for theologians to use goodness as a guide to what God's nature must be. Heck, for all humankind is able to know, it could be God's nature to lie to folks and promise believers he's going to take them to heaven when he really intends to send them to hell. And you can't say he wouldn't do that on account of it would be a bad thing, because by Dr. Craig's definition, it would be definitionally good by virtue of being God's nature. So we still on at least one horn of the Euthyphro Dilemma. If God's nature determines what goodness is, then goodness is arbitrary. God's nature could possess literally any arbitrary quality you can think of, good or bad, and it would be definitionally good according to Dr. Craig's argument. And of course, some believers are going to come back with, well, that ain't true because it says in God's word that God cannot lie. But just think about that for a minute. Whose word says God cannot lie? See, if it's God's word and it's God's nature to lie, then God could lie to us about whether or not he's able to lie to us. And we can't even say that it would be wrong for God to tell a lie, since God's nature is what determines what's right. So if it's his nature to lie to us, we has to call that good, at least according to Dr. Craig's argument here. The only way we can use goodness to infer what God's nature must be is if there's a standard of goodness that's independent of God's nature. And that's the second horn of the Euthyphro Dilemma. Dr. Craig may have moved the goalpost, but didn't do no good, because we still right back where we started. He's trying to make it sound like he's just giving us some kind of profound insight into the origins of morality. But if you look closely at what he's actually doing, you'll see that his argument depends on an implicit appeal to moral standards that's independent of God. Quote, God's own character defines what good is. God is essentially compassionate, fair, kind, impartial, and so on. His nature is the moral standard defining good and bad. End quote. Except that these ain't attributes that necessarily match the description of God that we read about in the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament. It ain't that God's nature defines what is good, it's that believers give God credit for qualities that we know from secular morality is going to be things that lots of folks approve of. And not only is these qualities arbitrary, they're subject to change on short notice. Let a society come down with a bad case of xenophobia and fascism, and suddenly God's nature ain't about charity and hospitality toward strangers. It's all about holy wrath and righteous judgment against so-called sinners. It's a reflection of the attitudes that's popular at the time, and if the attitudes change enough, then believers change what they describe as being God's nature. And let me also point out that, in fact, Dr. Craig himself don't really believe that God's nature defines what's good. According to the doctrine of the Trinity, God is a union of three distinct persons, each of whom is male. And that includes the Holy Spirit, whose pronouns is he, him, according to Jesus in John 15 and 16. So if God is literally a union of three male persons, that means he's literally a same-sex union by nature. And if God's nature is what defines what goodness is, then same-sex unions is good by nature. But you ain't going to hear Dr. Craig preaching on the goodness of same-sex unions anytime soon. He has a homophobic moral standard independent of God's nature that he uses to judge same-sex unions. And to be fair, I also have a moral standard independent of God's nature. But in my case, my standards is reality-based, and they use verifiable evidence to show that same-sex unions is a good thing, just like hetero relationships. Granted, it so happens that gay folks falls in love differently than straight folks. But so what? The result is still a committed, caring, supportive relationship, and relationships like that provide social stability and other benefits, besides not doing no harm to nobody else. I mean, things can and do go wrong between same-sex partners just like they do with hetero couples, but again, that's a parallel, not an argument against same-sex relationships. Overall, gay individuals and gay couples is a good thing, and they contribute a considerable amount to the health and prosperity of society in measurable, verifiable, objective ways. So hypothetically, if Dr. Craig was ever to change his mind and declare that same-sex unions is good because God is a same-sex union, he'd be coming to the right conclusion just for the wrong reasons, because God's nature ain't what determines moral standards. I mean, think about it. God's nature is just like the nature of anything else. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. If in God is consistent with his own nature, that don't imply any kind of obligation on anyone else's part to be consistent with God's nature, because they ain't God. God's nature is a description of the essential qualities that he's supposed to possess, just like the nature of anything else is just a description of its essential qualities. Maybe it's God's nature to order other folks around and tell them what to do and what not to do, but that don't imply that them folks has any kind of prescriptive obligation to do what he tells them. If he tells them stuff that's going to turn out to have beneficial consequences or to prevent negative consequences, then okay, that's good, but the standard of goodness we're using here is the consequences, not the nature of God. The goodness or badness of the consequences is what determines whether we regard God as being good or bad. And that's why Dr. Craig is careful to only describe God in terms that's known to be beneficial instead of using more biblically accurate terms like genocidal. Also, consider the fact that according to Dr. Craig, God's nature is that he is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. So whatever else is true about God's nature, it has to be consistent with God being timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. And that's a problem for morality, especially the part about being timeless. On account of that means that God's morality must also be changeless. Change is a difference in conditions between one point in time and a different point in time. So in order for anything to be timeless, it has to also be changeless. And that means God's supposed morality can't depend on anything that changes over time. God can't say that incest was okay back in the days of Adam and Eve or back in the days of Noah because conditions was different back then. If we say that incest was okay thousands of years ago, but it's bad today, that's a moral standard that changes over time. But moral standards based exclusively on God's nature can't do that. Same with slavery. Either owning folks as slaves and beating them within an inch of their lives and selling your own daughters as slaves is good all the time, or else it's bad all the time. Otherwise, you got a moral standard that ain't timeless and therefore ain't God's nature. You could suppose that maybe moral standards is some kind of combination of God's nature plus a consideration of the circumstances, but that's a slippery slope. By introducing a consideration of the circumstances, you're basing your morality, at least in part, on something that ain't dependent on God. And the trouble for apologists is that the more consideration you give to the circumstances and the consequences and the way other folks is going to respond to things, the more you realize you don't really need God's nature at all. You can get everything you need to know about the moral dimensions of a particular subject by studying the circumstances and consequences and public responses. And if by chance you still has moral questions after considering all the secular considerations, you're likely to find that God's nature don't add anything reliable to your investigation. It might give some apologists an excuse to voice their own personal opinions as if they was some kind of divine decree, but that ain't actual objective morality, that's just the apologist's personal opinion. So that's already a considerable number of problems with the idea that goodness comes from God's nature, but here's another one. Saying that goodness is defined by God's nature don't tell us nothing about what evil is. You might think, well, that's easy. Good means whatever's consistent with God's nature, so evil must be whatever ain't consistent with his nature. But is that really evil or just not good? Consider that according to Christian monotheism, there ain't no such thing as a female God. The Christian God can't have any kind of opposite sex attraction as part of his nature because he ain't got no opposite sex to be attracted to. He could theoretically be attracted to himself, or he could take advantage of his triune nature to have his distinct persons be attracted to each other even though they's all male, but heterosexual attraction ain't an option that's even open to him, so it can't be part of his nature. Some folks might say that this means heterosexual relationships must be evil because they ain't consistent with God's nature, so if God's nature defines what's good, at the very least you'd have to say that heterosexual relationships can't be good. Now what about ignorance and weakness? God's nature supposedly can't contain any flaw or defect, so if in his nature defines what is good, then we has two choices. Either we say anybody with flaws and weaknesses is evil because they ain't consistent with God's nature, or else we say, well, God's nature just can't tell us whether something's evil or only just not good. Well, someone might say that's okay because we can rely on God to tell us what's evil through divine revelation, because he's good by definition and therefore he's going to want us to know what evil is. But that's putting the cart before the horse. That's assuming that we have some kind of independent standard of good and evil so as we can know what qualities God's nature would have to possess. And that's Euthyphro's dilemma again, because if we has a standard of good and evil that's independent of God's nature, then like Dr. Craig said, that refutes premise one. Morality don't come from God's nature, it comes from the independent standard of morality that we use to decide which qualities we can attribute to God's nature. On the other hand, if we ain't got some independent standard we can use to determine what qualities is present in God's nature, then we ain't got no way to know for sure that his nature would possess precisely those qualities that would lead him to want to make sure we had an accurate and comprehensive understanding of what evil is, or what good is for that matter. By making God's nature the standard of goodness, we ain't specifying what goodness actually is, we're just arbitrarily declaring that whatever qualities we assign to God's nature, those qualities has to be acknowledged as being good. And that's kind of the real point of Dr. Craig's argument here. It don't get him off the hook of Euthyphro's dilemma, and it don't give us no insight into how morality works in the real world. All it really does is to preemptively claim goodness as the essence of God's nature, as a rhetorical device. And that's a power play that's made by preachers and apologists everywhere. Your standards of goodness don't count because goodness is defined by the nature of my God. Everything that's good, you owe to my God. You're in his debt, and that means you has to listen to what I tell you about what he wants from you in return. And by the way, you can't criticize him neither, because he's good by definition. So any criticisms you may have is necessarily just lies and sins against him. So yeah, this ain't just your average run-of-the-mill argument from creation myth here. Dr. Craig ain't just arbitrarily giving his personal deity credit for the moral patterns we see in real life. He's trying to do it in a way that silences criticism from the get-go and demands admiration and respect regardless of your own personal moral standards. And ironically, he's using some pretty bad logic in the process of trying to argue that the Euthyphro dilemma is bad logic. Quote, his commands necessarily reflect his moral nature. Therefore, they're not arbitrary. When the atheist demands, if God were to command child abuse, would we be obligated to abuse our children? He's asking a question like, If there were a square circle, would its area be the square of one of its sides? There is no answer because what it supposes is logically impossible. End quote. And he says it's logically impossible, but in fact it's not only possible, it's necessary. If God's nature is such that he demands child abuse, like, for example, requiring parents to mutilate the genitals of male children on the 8th day after their birth, and if we define goodness strictly in terms of God's nature, then you'd have to say that yes, folks would be obligated to mutilate their kids. But maybe that only applies to Jewish kids, and Gentile kids don't got to be circumcised. That brings up another problem with making God's nature your standard for goodness. If your only standard for goodness is God's nature, then it don't matter who you are, the standards is the same. God's nature don't change depending on whether you're Jewish or Gentile. If in God's nature says that circumcision is good, then it's good for everybody, Jew or Gentile. Also, God's nature don't change in response to major events in human history. So you can't say that circumcision and animal sacrifice and all that was only good during the Old Testament, and now that Jesus died on the cross, that standard has been changed. No, the same standards has to apply equally at all times to all folks regardless of their religion. And of course, that ain't how morality actually works. Even Christians know in practice that moral judgments is based on more than just a consideration of God's nature. There's a bunch of purely secular aspects independent of God's nature that has to be considered, like cultural factors and motives and circumstances and consequences. And that means that we can and do get our moral judgments from a source that's independent of God's nature, which means that premise 1 is wrong when it claims that God is required for us in order to have moral standards that is more than just subjective individual personal opinions. Dr. Craig wraps up his response to Euthyphro in grand style. Quote, "So the Euthyphro dilemma presents us with a false choice, and we shouldn't be tricked by it. The morally good/bad is determined by God's nature, and the morally right/wrong is determined by his will. God wills something because he is good, and something is right because God wills it." End quote. But in the end, Dr. Craig has failed to avoid the Euthyphro dilemma, and he can't help but appealing implicitly to external standards of morality that ain't dependent on God's nature in order to determine which qualities to attribute to that nature. To Christian slave owners in the antebellum South, God's nature was good, and therefore it was good for God to endorse chattel slavery for non-Jews. And that argument was convincing folks because they was appealing to pro-slavery social conventions that declared slavery to be good and in some extreme cases tried to argue that it was actually benevolent. But those social conventions has changed, so now Dr. Craig has to define God's nature in such a way as to tread a fine line between tolerating slavery in the Old Testament while still rejecting it in order to conform to modern sensibilities. It don't do no good to argue that God's nature defined goodness if there ain't no external independent standard of goodness we can use to decide whether or not God's nature endorses slavery or genocide or baby killing or beating children or whatever. Folks is free to claim that God's nature is such that he endorses whatever they want him to endorse and condemns whatever they want him to condemn. And the only way we can refute such claims is if we has an objective, independent moral standard that we can point to and say, in order for God's nature to be good, he has to have these qualities and not those qualities. So either Christians can arbitrarily claim whatever they want as moral standards simply by attributing them to God's nature, or else there has to be a moral standard to which even God himself is accountable, and that's the two horns of the Euthyphro dilemma, despite everything Dr. Craig can do to try and dodge them. Olay! And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we're going to be getting into moral Platonism, and we'll see how Dr. Craig makes out taking on Plato again. So far he ain't been doing too well, but maybe he'll have better luck next time. Meanwhile, thanks for watching. and please be kind wherever possible.